All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the webinar for the PSH RFA. Just to lay out the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview of the RFA. We're going to go into the funding resources available through the RFA, the application components, talk about thresholds, the scoring process, and then starting at about hopefully 2:15, we're going to go and spend about 30 minutes talking about what's new for 2025. From previous years. Then at 2:45, we'll have time for audience questions, and we'll hopefully adjourn by 3. So that's a quick outline of what we're going to run through today. I will share a version of the agenda here in the chat if anybody wants to follow along. If you have specific questions, just feel free to pop them in as I go through, but also if you have detailed questions, if you can hold them until 2:45, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so really quickly, just getting us going here. We've had one webinar already for the PSH RFA that took place on November 19th and was focused on the tenant-based vouchers available through the PSH RFA. So that webinar recording is linked in the PSH RFA. Today, we will be really focusing on the project-based supportive housing resources or single-site supportive housing. So just wanted to make sure, again, folks are in the right place. So the annual RFA for the creation of supportive housing, I will drop a link here in the chat, went live on the Division of Housing website on November 15th. It is a PDF document. You will see that we may have changes to the RFA over the next 12 months. So I just want to remind folks, don't download that document and save it in a folder. Go to the Division of Housing website and pull it down. We will make sure it has a timestamp on it so you can see when it was last modified. But we do anticipate that we will have changes to the RFA over the course of the next year on the availability of resources, and especially relating to the 9% pilot, and then what happens as a result of that pilot, which my colleague Teresa will be talking about later in the agenda. So the other thing, just for folks to be aware of, there are links, lots and lots of links in the RFA. So you can access information on the number of available resources. You can also track things like, have we received your letter of intent, through some public-facing documents. So, because these are all Google Drive documents, you may need a Google account in order to access some of these documents. Hopefully the permissions should be set up accordingly. I will provide viewer access to anyone who requests it, but because we don't want to have folks inadvertently adjusting the formatting, it'll just be viewer access. Okay. The other thing there is that there are lots of documents linked in the RFA as it described. In the subject, or sorry, in the title of the document, it will say make a copy. So that's how for the appendices, you will just make a copy of the relevant documents, and that's what you'll modify. So again, I know every year we have folks who request access to the original document. That'll just be my request, is make a copy of the Google Doc and create your own version. That's what you'll be editing and modifying. Okay. Those are just sort of the basic logistics. Now I want to go into what is the PSH RFA. So it is a partnership between the Department of Local Affairs Division of Housing, the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, and local municipalities designed to increase the number of high-quality supportive housing opportunities in Colorado. We define supportive housing as an intervention that combines affordable housing with access to wraparound supportive services in order to help individuals with complex barriers to housing stability secure safe, stable housing. The services that are available to residents of supportive housing are designed to be provided in keeping with best practices. So that means trauma-informed care, harm reduction, motivational interviewing. Those are the type of best practices we're really looking for in this program model. One thing to keep in mind, the supportive housing program model is intended to serve folks with complex barriers. So the goal of this RFA is to serve individuals who may not be successful in other housing interventions, are who and typically we talk about folks who are the least likely to self-resolve. So that's really the target population for the RFA, is those folks who are utilizing emergency systems at the highest cost, often with the worst outcomes, because they really need the supportive housing intervention in order to secure long-term stability. All right, so let me start screen sharing the RFA so we can walk through some of these items. And we are not going to have slides this afternoon. I've shared a link to the agenda, but if folks can follow along, you're welcome to do so with the RFA. This will just be some quick screen sharing. So what you'll see is we have 4 rounds of the RFA. So letters of intent for the upcoming round are due on December 13th, and then applications are due February 3rd. That round is for the competitive tax credit 9% round. If you have a tenant-based application, if you have a non-competitive LIHTC application or a non-LIHTC application, you can also apply on that round. But that round is intended to align with the 9% application project process round. But any project type can also apply, unless you're applying for the 4% plus state, which is again locked in, and that's happening later. So the next round, which is for non-competitive LIHTC, non-LIHTC, and tenant-based, has LOIs due April 1st, applications due May 2nd. The next round, which is the 4% plus state, has LOIs due June 2nd and applications due August 1st. And then the last round of the RFA has applications due, has LOIs due October 1st, applications due November 3rd. So those are the application rounds. Now, something I do want to flag that is new or updated for this year is that non-competitive LIHTC applications and non-LIHTC applications and tenant-based applications, if you do not receive a Tier 1 designation, and there are 3 tiers available through the PSH RFA. There's exceed supportive housing quality standards, Tier 1, meet supportive housing quality standards, Tier 2, and does not meet supportive housing quality standards, Tier 3. If your application for a non-competitive tax credit round does not receive an immediate Tier 1 designation, you will be moved to subsequent rounds. Now, right, so that means, hopefully that's good news, right? Your application didn't, but you will roll to the next round. The challenge is new applications may come in. So every round will become more competitive as we move through the RFA. That's something we piloted this past year. We're sort of formalizing it a little bit more this year. We've used this type of allocation process through some of the American Rescue Plan Act resources that we had and found it to be successful. But I do want to flag, if you are applying for competitive tax credit, and that means the 9% or the 4% plus state, you will not roll forward. You will not roll into the next round, because we're really working closely with CHAPA on those projects. Any questions on that rolling forward for non-tax credit, non-competitive tax credit, and tenant-based vouchers? Okay, terrific. So let's talk about the submission process. So applications need to be submitted via email to me at zach.schaffner@state.co.us. You need to be submitting those applications as a single PDF document or as a PDF document with, and we'll allow exceptions for the supportive service budgets or the budget documents. It may not be appropriate for those to be PDFs if they need to be Excels or Google Sheets, things like that. But our goal is that you send those as a PDF, and then the materials that you send to Division of Housing via email, if you are submitting applications to CHAFA for tax credits, you also need to send a copy of everything that goes to Division of Housing to CHAFA, and it needs to be uploaded to Procorum. One of the neat things that we're doing with that application tracker, which is a live link, is that we will indicate which staff need to have access to your application in Procorum. We also have a copy of the document sharing approval form that CHAFA uses linked in the RFA. So that would be our request, is making sure that if you're applying for tax credits and if you're applying through the RFA and you are also applying for tax credits, make sure that your application is uploaded to Procorum and the materials are shared with Division of Housing staff so they have access. I do want to flag, the intention of that is if there's an application cure that's needed at Division of Housing, that you can cure that with us. CHFA does not have that same sort of curing process that exists through their application process. But we don't want to have an instance where, right, you don't upload the CSH commitment to quality documentation to Division of Housing, and that impacts your tax credit application. So that's why we have you submitting materials to both CHFA and DOH via email to DOH, via Procorum for CHFA, is so that we can do that cure process. And so the intention of that cure process is we can flag if you're missing something. We'll quickly turn that around and make sure you're aware of that so you can get the necessary documents uploaded. Okay. All right. Let's go through the next component. Well, let me pause. Any questions about the submission process? And feel free to either use the chat or raise your hand. Terrific. Okay, we're going to keep it rolling here. So the resources that are available through the RFA. The first one are rental assistance vouchers. So we will be making 300 project-based vouchers available through the PSH RFA. There are different configurations of vouchers that are available. So this includes, and I'll scroll down so you can see this, right? Project-based housing choice vouchers, or sorry, project-based HUD Veteran Affairs, HUD VASH vouchers, state housing vouchers, Section 811 project-based rental assistance, and then host-funded rental assistance if you're working with the Denver Department of Housing Stability. So, and then the tenant-based vouchers will all be state housing vouchers. We're not going to talk too much today about tenant-based state housing vouchers. We will, as we did with the 2024 PSH RFA, we will not be making project-based housing choice vouchers available through this RFA. That's based on the constraints that we have with our housing choice voucher budget and where we are in the number of those resources that are project-based, which we are subject to limitations with HUD on those. But you can still apply for federal vouchers, including HUD VASH and Section 811. Each of these different rental subsidies, and we'll talk about tenant selection plans later, has a slightly different eligibility criteria. Obviously, for HUD VASH vouchers, that includes individuals need to have veteran status, approved veteran status. For individuals who are pursuing state housing vouchers, those individuals need to have a history of homelessness as well as a disabling condition. For the Section 811 program, individuals need to have those eligible disability status for those resources. There's also some restrictions there. And then host, I think, has got their own eligibility criteria for those resources. Okay, so that's the rental assistance vouchers, 300 project-based vouchers roughly. Again, if we have applicants bring their own vouchers from their local public housing authority, that number may shift. Also, depending on how many Section 811 vouchers, HUD VASH vouchers, et cetera, that folks are requesting. So it's roughly 300. We do have a fixed number of 50 tenant-based vouchers that we will be making available through this RFA. So those are, and we have in the RFA a lovely link, pretty straightforward little spreadsheet that will show you how many vouchers are remaining through the course of the RFA. And that's a live link that will be updated as we go through these application rounds. Okay, next I'm going to talk about tenancy support services, and then I promise you will hear from someone else soon, so you don't just have to hear my voice. So tenancy support services are supportive housing services funding. The intention of those tenancy support service funding is to fill the gap needed to meet the minimum supportive services standards that Division of Housing has introduced. And we've used these for several years now, and that is a minimum of $7,200 per household in supportive services, as well as a 15-to-1 client-to-case management ratio. Applicants can apply for up to $3,600 of tenancy support services per household, with a strong preference that those services dollars are very valuable and precious. And so we prioritize them for Division of Housing vouchers. If you have host vouchers or vouchers from another PHA, you do not have a guaranteed assurance that you will get that $3,600 for those vouchers. However, Division of Housing does do some work behind the scenes with entities like Host and Denver Housing Authority in order to sort of, if Denver is providing vouchers or DHA or Host is providing vouchers, then we can have, in those instances, we can provide tenancy support services. But again, tenancy support service dollars really intended as a gap filler. So we want our applicants to be leveraging all of the other funding sources they can. I will be talking a little bit later about some of the Medicaid components, as there have been some shifts in the landscape. And there's a lovely link in there that describes some of that. But the goal is that that's a gap filler. We also know tenancy support services funding is very valuable. So folks can apply for up to $3,600 in tenancy support services through the PSH RFA. You can only apply for those funds and include them in your supportive service plan and budget from years 1 to 5. If you include those outside of that range and or you assume that those dollar amounts will increase with inflation, we'll flag that for you as a threshold issue and say, hey, you need to revise your supportive service plan and budget. DOH TSS funding is only available from years 1 to 5, a maximum amount of funding of $3,600 per household per year. Okay, I think that will do it for me. I will pause so we can talk about the grants and loans funding, and I'll turn it over to Teresa.
Thanks, Zach. And hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Casano. I'm the Director of the Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability at DOH. Nice to meet you all. So I'm here to talk about the gap funding component. As some of you may have seen in the RFA, we're proposing a pilot for our February round to expand the scale of the RFA to include a conditional determination for loan or grant assistance. What does that mean? So the total conditional determinations that we're making available for projects applying to the February 3rd, 2025 round is going to be $10 million. We will not overcommit the $10 million. And at this point, we're not making money available to future funding rounds, but that will depend on funding availability. To clarify, this source of funds is intended to be state Prop 123 funds, and so it will not, we don't anticipate to trigger some of the federal requirements that are noted for the project-based rental assistance unless those two sources are paired together. To receive this gap funding, applicants must also be applying to the CHFA 9% round, also due in February. So to be clear, it is a 1-for-1. You can apply for gap financing if you're applying to the CHFA round. Applicants can request up to $60,000 per unit in loan or grant assistance. And you can apply for this gap funding without applying for the project-based rental assistance or the tenant support services. One note is that we will not be making partial awards here. It is sort of an all or nothing to accommodate CHFA's process. So as you think about what your funding request will be for your project, know that is a risk. So the conditional determination basically is serving as a pre-application for us, right? So we will accept the RFA application, and then when you're ready to actually apply for the gap funding from DOH, the conditional determination allows that you can apply for the DOH funding within a year of your award of tax credits. Any final award is going to be dependent on a full application and funding availability, but this basically allows us to reserve the amount of funding that you need. I will note that this RFA process will only commit what you ask for in the RFA. So if you end up getting a CHFA award, things change down the line. If you have a larger gap, need to increase your request, that will be totally subject to DOH's typical competitive rounds. We're offering money in the form of grants or loans, though note if there is a nonprofit partner in the ownership structure, we would prioritize grants to those projects. Awesome. So that's a little bit of the overview of the gap funding piece. Are there any questions on the resources available through the RFA before we move on?
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
They're a little more for Zach. Zach, so if we apply for $3,600 per unit in TSS funding for DOH, what can we apply for host through this RFA for TSS funding?
I believe Host is currently doing $1,500 per household per year.
Okay.
That's the number they've historically used, and I think that would be a conversation to have with Host staff in preparing your LOI. Is Host gonna? That's been my understanding. Is Host is still making that per unit subsidy, but I believe it's $1,500.
Okay, so talk to Host first, and then we can apply for that funding through this RFA.
Yes.
Okay. And then my second question is that, so you had listed that we can apply for host-funded rental assistance. Is that vouchers?
Yes, it is. So my best description is Division of Housing created the state housing voucher as an approximation of the federal housing choice voucher. Host created their rental subsidy as an approximation of the state housing voucher. So it's really exciting. I think one thing for applicants to be aware of is the structure of that is a little bit unique in how Host is making that funding available. So it may not operate as a typical voucher. And a component of that is that a voucher administrating agency is not required for Host's vouchers. And this sort of relates to the fact that Host is, unlike Division of Housing, Host is not a public housing authority, so they don't have that same voucher infrastructure in-house.
Okay, thank you. And then, so if we apply for the Host funded rental assistance and DOH vouchers, is that total combined the 60 vouchers, or could we apply for 60 DOH and 60 Host?
You could apply for 60 DOH and 60 Host.
Great. So the 60 is a DOH maximum.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Okay. Well, thank you for that question. We're going to move on to talk about the application components and threshold review. So one thing you'll notice, hopefully the screen sharing is still coming through, you'll see Appendix 3, required application contents and instructions. And that will bring you to a link that you can click to take you to a Google Doc, and you will see the subject line is annual questions for annual RFA, create a copy. So this what I'm sharing right now is what you will likely be spending the most time modifying and working in. And that's our request, is that you take this document, this is what you modify, you can take components out of this, format it appropriately, but this just makes it easier for applicants to use this document, this Appendix 3 as it's referred to. When you do submit it to DOH, just basically download it as a PDF, make a copy, edit it in Google Docs. You can download it as a Microsoft Word document, etc. But then please share it as a PDF document when you send an email to me, so that we can search for it. That searching function is really valuable, especially for the threshold review, so we can just do a quick search, turn that around quickly. If you don't submit it as a PDF, we will reach out and ask you to do that again. Please do not submit what I would refer to as a flat or scanned PDF, where you type something out and then you run it through a scanner. That makes it very difficult for us to pick up those characters and do that quick search. Okay. Right, so application components and threshold review, talked about that already. Let's talk about the supportive service plan and budget. So that is another component of the RFA. So we have examples of the supportive service plan and budget, and then we also have empty documents that are basically ready to be filled in. So let me go ahead and pull that up real quick. So that supportive service plan and budget has two sections, a top and a bottom. I will pull that up in just a second here. I'll show the template. So let's see that. Apologies. Okay, so this is a blank version of the template. You will see The first tab is for project-based applications. The second tab is for tenant-based. The biggest differences you will see between these two budgets is that the tenant-based does not include things like the service reserve balance. It does not include cash flow, services contributions, things like that, right? The developer fee boost is not relevant for tenant-based applications. So you're going to be using the project-based tab of this if you're applying for project-based vouchers, tenant-based tab if you're applying for tenant-based. The goal is the top section of this document are the services. So these are, right, you'll see things like case management. You may see some front desk costs included here, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But these are the services that your residents of your supportive housing units have access to. If you're doing a 100-unit development and only 20 of those units are permanent supportive housing, so you're going to have 80 affordable, 20 permanent supportive housing. This voucher, this number here in cell 29 is going to be 20, because those are the individuals who have a supportive housing resource. And this is another component of the PSH RFA, is it's not supportive housing if there isn't a voucher attached to it. And that also goes in the house. We're looking at things like the Type 89 provider and Medicaid. So there has to be a voucher in place. So that top section is really going to go into the case management, the other services that are available, things like client transportation, you're going to include there, training costs, things like that. The bottom section is how you're going to pay for it. So this is where you're going to have, right, how much, the amount of services that are going, the amount of cash flow going to supportive services, the amount of Medicaid, things like that. This is where you'd put the DOH tenancy support services funding. This is where you would put host services funding. If you're able to leverage continuum of care funding, things like that. The other option that we see, right, is the service reserve. That's what we would refer to as your developer fee boost. You would put those funds into a service reserve and you draw down on them over the course of the 15-year application timeline included here. One thing I want to flag, you should not have anything listed as in kind in this budget, right? Everything, even if, right, it's coming from an existing grant, we want to know that funding source and how it's being leveraged. So if you have a grant from the office, the Behavioral Health Administration, put that down on there. This is just how all of those needs described in the top section of the budget are being met. What you'll also see, we're looking for that $7,200 per household per year. We're looking to that 15-to-1 client to case management ratio to be demonstrated in this document. One flag I want to put in here, no more than 50% of the service budget can be funded with cash flow. And the rationale behind that is that we do not want to see projects get stuck in a death spiral, for lack of a better term, where, right, you can't maintain occupancy, so you don't have cash flow, and so you don't have, services available to residents. And that's why we impose that request that no more than 50% of services be funded through cash flow. I do also want to flag, if a project's average debt service coverage ratio exceeds 1.3, the applicant is expected to contribute additional cash flow to supportive services funding. If you have questions, concerns about those details, want to encourage folks to reach out, connect with myself, connect with staff from the Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability to talk about that. We know that there's a lot of interplay between the service budget, the operating budget, and the development budget. Another example is security or safety costs. We'll see instances where those costs are shared, between the operating budget and the services budget. Our general recommendation is, costs that would typically, right, if it was 100% of affordable development, what are those safety costs? Those would go in the operating budget. The things that are unique to supportive housing, those would go in the services budget. Happy to talk more about that if folks have questions, but that's been our general recommendation for the last few years. Every project does things a little differently. We are not, I don't think, super dogmatic on how you plan that division between the operating and the services budget. Okay, any question on the service budget and plan?
Yeah. Hey, Zach, this is Kuehl. From Mercy Housing. So thanks, Teresa and Zach, for the great presentation. Quick question. Maybe this is obvious, but we provide the services budget even if we are not requesting the TSS component from DOH, correct?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. I just wanted to confirm that. And is there a minimum amount per unit, regardless if we're asking for DOH TSS or not, that you would like to see, or is like typical as a
Yes.
parameter guideline?
Yes. So
And what,
great question. Really appreciate that. Even if you are not applying for DOH TSS, we would still want to see that you're meeting that 7,200 per household in supportive
7,000.
services.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure thing. And I will acknowledge that number is a few years old. It came from some great work from the Corporation for Supportive Housing. It's the minimum. Folks can exceed that. We may have questions, and I think we flagged this in the RFA, if your supportive services exceed 10,000 per household per year. But we also know that this gets a little tricky if you're serving multi-person households, right? If you've got a bunch of 3 and 4 bedroom units and you know, that minimum may not be appropriate there, but we'll leave that at individual applicants' discretion. But really appreciate that question. We still impose that 7,200 and that 15-to-1 client to case management ratio for anybody who's applying through the PSH RFA, independent of your plans to apply for tenancy support services, to apply for project-based vouchers, or through the 9% pilot that Teresa was describing. So that is, we are defining supportive housing in that way, that it must have those access to services, it must have that client to case management ratio, and there must be a rental subsidy, whether it be local, state, or federally funded. Okay. Let's next talk about tenant selection plans. And this is, you'll be looking at within the PSH RFA, this would be Appendix 4. So we have a series of tenant selection plan templates. We would really request, we don't require, but we would request that you take a look at our templates. They are quite thoughtful. I feel like it's its own fun science of tenant selection plans. What we're trying to do a lot of different things with those tenant selection plans. So I'll start screen sharing one of those really quickly so you can get a sense of what we're trying to do with those tenant selection plans. So these tenant selection plans dictate who has access to these supportive housing units. We know if you've got local vouchers, your local PHA may require that you use their tenant selection plan. That's okay. Typically our tenant selection plan, we've had other PHAs adopt our tenant selection plan. Like we have a great project in Pueblo that uses the DOH tenant selection plan for both voucher types. So I will screen share this tab real quick. Okay, again, create a copy. It's in the subject line, hopefully that's clear. So there's 4 components of the tenant selection plan. The eligibility criteria, and that will change based on your subsidy. So the eligibility criteria for a state housing voucher is different from that of a HUD-VASH voucher, is different from a Section 811 voucher, etc. So this is the state housing voucher, project-based state housing voucher tenant selection plan. You'll see those eligibility criteria. The student eligibility looks a little strange. Again, this is where the state housing voucher is a approximation of the federal housing choice voucher. Everything we don't specifically specify is deviating from the housing choice voucher lines up, including things like student eligibility. Then we have referral sources. We ask that a minimum of 50% of referrals come through coordinated entry. Now, we will allow exceptions to this policy for certain populations, and this is specified in the RFA. For example, if you are planning to serve households with child welfare involvement, we will allow you to take 100% of referrals through the child welfare system, because those households, right, typically are not engaging with the coordinated entry systems. So we will allow exceptions to that, but generally, unless you have a very clear reason, we will ask that 50% of referrals come through coordinated entry and 50% come through a DOH approved process. So that could be, right, 50% through coordinated entry, 50% through a crosswalk between the lead service provider and coordinated entry. We've done that in several instances. We know there's a relationship between supportive services funding and referrals. We know that that is not ideal. Ideally, we would love to get to 100% of referrals through coordinated entry systems. There are efforts underway, and again, I'll talk about the Type 89 provider type, but for now, we and the relevant partners feel pretty good about what we refer to as the 50-50 split compromise, which allows 50% of referrals to come through coordinated entry, 50% through a DOH-approved referral process. We're very excited. One update for this year is that if you are planning to take referrals for justice-involved individuals, we're encouraging folks to work with the Harvard Kennedy School's Government Performance Lab. It's an opportunity. We've made justice-oriented supportive housing resources available in the past. GPL is really looking at this through the lens of the sequential intercept model of, okay, if you are planning to serve folks who have jail involvement, what's the best way to identify that population? If you're working with folks from Department of Corrections, what's the best way to work with that population? So we're really excited to have GPL as a partner in this, in working with justice-involved individuals. I think we've just learned more about what those referrals should ideally look like, and know that justice involved is a big category, and we want you to work with the experts to go further in depth on that. Okay. The last component, so you have referral sources, then you have preferences. I do want to point out, and I know this is its own science of tenant selection plans, preferences would only apply to non-coordinated entry referrals. And the reason for that is that coordinated entry referrals basically come pre-prioritized, right? If you're working with the one home coordinated entry system, they are typically including a preference for individuals with long lengths of homelessness, for individuals who are chronically homeless, for individuals who are fleeing domestic violence. So it's not necessary to add preferences to the one home system. Individual projects can work with one home. We know there have been some challenges with coordinated entry referrals. We are in the process of convening a working group on this topic, but want to flag that those preferences really they only apply to the non-coordinated entry referrals. And then the last thing is criminal screening criteria. And the goal is different subsidies impose different criminal screening criteria. For example, historically, the Housing Choice Voucher Program does not allow participants to include folks who are on the lifetime registered sex offender registry, or individuals who have been convicted of production of methamphetamine in a public housing authority owned unit. And then also there's provisions around individuals who have outstanding debts to public housing authorities. The last one, hopefully very easily remedied, and we see that happen often. But the individual subsidy will dictate your criminal screening criteria. What we're looking for is for your criminal screening criteria to be as minimal as possible. There are tons of reasons why individuals don't get into permanent supportive housing. We don't want your tenant selection plan to be another reason for that. So we will allow folks to add to the criminal screening criteria, but we want to understand why that's occurring, right? Is this property in close proximity to a school? Are there other reasons why, if you are planning to serve individuals who are fleeing domestic violence, if you're including certain things like that. So we want it to be as minimal as possible, and we want to understand why it's being added. Okay. Any questions on supportive service plan and budgets or tenant selection plans? Okay, I'm just going to keep it rolling here. So, letter from the voucher admin agency. So I will stop presenting and do some more talking. So if you are applying for Division of Housing Resources, and specific Division of Housing Resources, you will need a DOH voucher administrating agency. If you are applying for HUD-VASH in Denver Metro, a voucher admin agency is not needed, as Division of Housing will administer those vouchers in-house. If you're applying for Section 811 vouchers, a voucher administration agency is not necessary, as Division of Housing will administer those vouchers in-house. If you're applying for host vouchers, they administer, or they are, right, their vouchers work a little differently. But if you're applying for state housing vouchers, tenant-based or project-based, or you're applying for HUD-VASH outside of Denver Metro, you need to have a DOH-approved voucher administrating agency. Voucher administrating agencies are super important to the supportive housing program model. there is no voucher without a voucher administrating agency. And so what we are now doing is we are vetting your voucher administrating agency when you submit your letter of intent. So we will ask questions, we will do a quick review and say, okay, do you have a DOH voucher administrating agency? And then what is their current status? And the reason why we're asking that is we know that voucher administration agency capacity can change rapidly, right? All of a sudden, if an agency is used to working with 200 and then 4 projects reach out to them to administer a total of 200 more vouchers, that's a huge increase for them to all of a sudden need to absorb all those vouchers if those projects are selected. So we may have some questions about that. We also, right, depending on the performance of the voucher administrating agency, if they're having challenges with their doing annuals, things like that, we may flag them and we will indicate to you as an applicant, hey, looks like you need to find another voucher administrator. So we'll flag that, turn that around for you as quick as we can when we receive your LOI so that you can secure another DOH approved voucher administrating agency. If you cannot find one, you cannot proceed. So we know that those voucher administrating agencies are very valuable. They're a super important part, and we're really in continuing to include them as a necessary component, trying to really emphasize you should have a strong working relationship with your voucher administrator. They're the ones who are going to be doing often the inspections, unless they have an ownership stake, and then we'll ask for another entity as that's a potential conflict of interest. But we will look for those entities to do the briefing, to do the recertification process, right? They're processing the paperwork, they're doing the add and remove household members, they're doing tenant selection, they're doing tenant conferences oftentimes. So they're really playing an important role in your project, and we want to make sure that they're on board. And so they may be, right, we've seen instances where our voucher administrating agencies may need a component of the tenancy support services funding we're requiring or we're providing in order to provide voucher administration support. Again, they play a really important role, and that's why we're trying to bring them into this process earlier. And then just because we've added so many new voucher administrating agencies, that's why we're adding that layer. If we got to, not only are they approved and they're on the list, but they're in good standing with DOH as of the application being submitted, the LOI being submitted. So we'll do that added layer. Okay. Roles and responsibilities document. That is another linked appendix of the application. Specifically, it is Appendix 6 and 7. And Appendix 6 is tenant-based roles and responsibilities. Appendix 7 is project-based roles and responsibilities. I'm going to screen share this. Before I do that, I know I'm talking a lot. Very quickly. Any questions on the voucher administrator?
I have a question. It's kind of theoretical, I guess. I know you had that RFA last year to have new voucher administrators. Is that closed now?
It is closed.
Okay.
Yes.
So don't apply with a new voucher administrator. You have to have someone who's already established.
Correct. Yes, you would need we do not have the ability to bring on new voucher administrating agencies through this RFA.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Really good question. Appreciate that. Okay, so project-based roles and responsibilities. Let me screen share. This is a document that we'd included in 2024, but we're including again in 2025. I think this may have been a mid-RFA edition. So what this does is this is a document we created as a technical assistance tool that describes different things happening over the course of a participant's participation in supportive housing. So things like vacancy referrals, issuance, briefing, unit eligibility, lease signing, long-term things, move-outs, terminations, tenancy crises, all sorts of different things. So this really outlines who is expected to do what. Individual projects may modify this document. The intention is, right, we want everyone to go in with a full understanding of what the voucher administrator, the lead service provider, the property manager, and division of housing does. And so you'll see at the bottom of this document, signatory lines. We know that can be a little confusing. We'll flag it for you through the cure process if it's not signed, but we want to know. And if you don't have a property manager identified, we want to understand, and there's a section of the RFA on how they will be selected. But we want to know, right, and just this sort of things are going to happen. This is permanent supportive housing. Clients are going to engage in big behavior. If we were having clients who weren't going to engage in big behavior, they wouldn't be our target population. So this document has been really helpful for existing supportive housing, and we're bringing it in for new supportive housing for folks to get an understanding of the type of things that are going to go into your project operating in the long term. So we want to see that signed by the relevant project partners so they understand that the type of things they're going to do, when to go to Division of Housing, what Division of Housing does throughout these stages, what the voucher administrator, property manager, service provider does. You are welcome to customize this document further for your organization, your individual project. So that's your discretion, but we would just ask that you create a copy for your project, fill it out, and include it in your application. Okay. Last thing before we go into the scoring process. So the commitment and verification of sources. So this is another appendix of the RFA. It's Appendix 8, the last section of the RFA, or last appendix of the RFA. So this is really where you are verifying the funding sources included in the bottom section of your supportive service budget and plan, right? That's where you listed your Medicaid, your developer fee, your cash flow contribution. So this is basically a document where your developer is confirming that, yes, we are making this developer fee reserve available for supportive services over this term. We are making, this $10,000 in cash flow available to supportive services in years 1 through 15, or, however that's fluctuating. So we want to see that. This intention here is that we don't want to have any surprises. We don't want to have projects open up and then all of a sudden the developer says, oh, actually, we're not on the hook for that cash flow. Yes, if it's in the original application, we want to have that documentation to ensure that the relevant project partners are really complying with what they put into the application. And this document is a way to really ensure that that occurs. So it's for the long-term stability of the project. We know that the services funding is essential. And now I will talk a little bit about Medicaid. So for the uninitiated, as of October 1st, the Colorado Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, HCPF, introduced a new supportive housing provider type. It did not exist previously. There are 2 billing codes that exist now for that provider type, H0043 and H0044, which are the monthly and the daily reimbursement rate for supportive housing. This is a really big deal. But I want to flag that provider type, which Division of Housing provides through a letter, is only available to existing supportive housing projects and providers. So folks can request the letter from Division of Housing to become a Type 89 provider if it's already open, or up to 4 months prior to a project opening. So you won't be able to get a letter for a new project through the PSH RFA for new construction. If you are applying for tenant-based, that can be right. A lot of the materials from the PSH RFA and what we're using for the provider type align intentionally. So if you've gone through the PSH RFA, you should have most of the documents like the supportive service plan and budget, the tenant selection plan, the verification of funding sources. They'll all line up. But this is a new resource that we really are encouraging folks to make sure you're aware of. And a big part of that is connecting with your regional accountable entity or your RAE. We know the RAE regions have changed, but the RAEs are the payers for Medicaid. So if you are including Medicaid funding in your supportive service budget, we want to see a letter of support from your RAE, so that you're not just saying, we're pretty sure we're going to get $25,000 in Medicaid funding. We want to see that your RAE is aware of your project and supportive, because they're the ones who are going to need to pay that $25,000 to you and reimburse you. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. If you're including that Medicaid, we just want to see that letter of support. It doesn't have to include an exact dollar amount. We know that the Medicaid landscape is changing. We have the new Type 89 provider type. We have, fingers crossed, our 1115 waiver that's going to CMS. That will change things if it's approved as of July 1st, 2025. So the amount of Medicaid funding that your project will be able to draw down in 3 years versus today may look a little different. That's where we want you to be engaged with your RAE, to have a realistic number that you're including in that process, or in that services budget. Okay, I'll pause there before we go into scoring and we go into the rubric. Any questions on the commitment and verification of funding sources? All right, I know. I'm just going to keep on talking. So let's talk about the scoring. So there are two components of scoring. One is the tier designation of tier 1, 2, or 3, which I described earlier. The other is the numeric, is that the right word? Numeric? The number, the score that you will get. So we have a rubric included in the PSH RFA, which is, I believe, out of 200 points. And so that rubric is used and has been expanded to its current scale. Let me just pull that up real quick. So there are bonus points. I wanna call that out up top. Not everyone took advantage of this in previous years. So the bonus points that exist are for rural projects located in Colorado communities with a population of 180,000 or fewer. And then the other component where we provide bonus points, it's a little bit hidden in the RFA, is for projects that are responsive to the trauma associated with the separation of individuals from their pets. I won't go into how that exciting bonus point got added to the RFA, but it exists. You can get an extra 2 points if in your application you describe how your pet policy will be responsive to the needs of clients experiencing homelessness who have a lot of trauma and often are surviving on the streets, and their animal companions play a huge part in their success and stability. So we just want to, if you include that and talk about it in some way, we'll give you those bonus points. Okay, so let's go into the scoring and let me do the screen sharing. Okay, so
Zach, this is Kuehl. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get off mute on the last one. What does RAE actually stand for?
Sure, apologies. That's the Regional Accountable Entity.
Oh, thank you. Okay, that was one of those acronyms I didn't know. Thank you.
No problem. And those RAE regions have changed. There are now 4 RAEs. If you're in Denver Metro, your RAE region is Colorado Access, or your RAE provider is Colorado Access. If you're on the Western Slope, it's Rocky Mountain Health Plans. And then there are 2 other RAEs whose names escape me. I think it's Colorado. It's CCHA is the acronym, and we have another one. But the RAE landscape has changed. The new RAE details will, the new RAE regions are effective, I think, next year. So if you're in a region that's changing, you can just specify that and provide that clarification as a letter, just saying, hey, our current RAE will no longer exist. It's only certain counties that are in that instance. Most of the RAE regions are staying the same. It's only, I think, in the Roaring Fork, Eagle Valley, and then also the Upper Arkansas regions that have lost their RAE and they're being replaced with a new entity. I'm going off track from our rubric. My apologies. So this rubric, we talked about the bonus points. You get points for leveraging vouchers from local public housing authorities. And then also, I don't want to go too far in this, but I talked about that move rolling forward. If you don't get a tier 1 designation for a non-tax credit, non-competitive tax credit, or tenant-based, you'll roll forward. And I do also want to flag a significant change in that if you are applying for the conversion of existing or occupied affordable housing, you are ineligible to receive a tier 1 designation. Doesn't mean your project can't proceed. We have funded tier 2 projects. CHAFA has funded tier 2 projects, but we know that converting existing housing that's currently occupied to supportive housing is really difficult, right? You have to assess, how were those original tenants selected? Do they retain their homeless status? How, if you're planning to attrition those clients, it's really challenging. And so it can be done, but it's not our highest priority, and it's ineligible for a tier 1 designation. Okay. The other components, and let me scroll, and then we'll give you a break from hearing from me, is we have components like, supportive service plan and budget, property management experience, trauma-informed design, including the perspective of folks with lived experience, responding to or advancing the goals around inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and then prior performance by project partners outside of the RFA. So we'll look at things like occupancy rates, exits to homelessness, staffing level commitments, long-term monitoring, and compliance issues. And for that scoring, we're going to be working with the Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability so that, right, we're in lockstep of if we've got issues with prior, and that means anyone in your project. So if your property management company has concerns, if your developer owner has concerns, if your lead service provider has concerns, if your voucher administrating agency has concerns, we're going to look at that prior performance. And I'll pause there. Teresa, anything you want to add on prior performance from the OHS perspective before I go to financial feasibility? And you're on mute, Teresa. Apologies.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yep.
All right. For some reason, the headphones muted me because they were so excited to listen to Zach talk. They don't want me to hear about past experience or financial feasibility. I get it. So specifically, we're looking at two things, sort of your experience. So DOH experience, affordable housing experience, and then we're looking at your compliance record with our asset management team. So the presence of repeat findings, escalation letters, poor performance, that's all going to have a negative impact on your score in this particular area.
Terrific. Okay. And like I said, we've updated the scoring. So the maximum score is now 200. So we've increased the weight of that prior performance question as well as the financial feasibility question. And that really is intended to align, especially with the 9% pilot, as we are evaluating and making those, or OHFS is making those resources available for the 9% pilot, and is doing a more in-depth evaluation in conjunction with that, to Teresa's point. Okay. Any questions on the updated scoring before we go into the other updates that we haven't described yet for 2025?
Hey, Zach, this is Kuehl again. If we were getting, just hypothetically, like directly from HUD VA VASH vouchers, would that count as a local match for your vouchers in
Yes.
that case?
Yes.
Okay.
But I do, and I know this HUD VASH vouchers can be, we have challenges with HUD VASH vouchers and how folks think about the match. So Division of Housing has its own allocation of HUD VASH resources that we can make available. And then local public housing authorities have a separate and distinct. So in order for DOH to put HUD VASH in a project, we need to have a letter of support from the VA indicating, okay, yes, DOH is cleared to give its allocation. Like, we're okay with these vouchers being in this location. A lot of that relates to services capacity, as the VA is providing case management support for VA. But if you have local public housing authority HUD VASH, and this is right, like what are federal HUD vouchers? They're all federal. But if they're from another PHA, that's when they'll count, and you'll get those additional points if you're match for match. So it has to be HUD VASH from another PHA. It can't be DOH's HUD VASH.
Got it.
But really great question. Okay.
Before we go on, Zach, just one more thing on Section M, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this, but the reason we're asking for the pro quorum access is because we will be looking at your CHAFA budget, and specifically what we're looking for there, right, to do that Section N feasibility analysis is looking at the reasonableness of other costs, your total development costs per unit, and then the DOH request as a % of total project costs. Worth it to say again, the maximum that we will sort of recognize for this 10 million is $60,000 per unit, but we will not be making partial awards.
Terrific. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, so going to run through, I think we've talked about most of these already. So I'm going to run through them quickly, not going to screen share, and then we're going to turn it over to any more audience questions. So I shared before, existing housing that's being converted to supportive housing is ineligible to receive a Tier 1 designation. We can still fund it, but it just will not get that Tier 1 designation. So if it's non-tax credit, non-competitive tax credit, it will automatically roll to the next round. You could potentially roll all the way through from February to November. Depending on your financing, that may not be feasible. We'll flag that for you, and you can track that in the LOI document. I flagged the Harvard Kennedy School Data Performance Lab Assistance that's available for clients, or for applicants who are planning to apply for justice-involved individuals. Want to flag the changed accessibility standards. So any project applying for federally funded project-based vouchers from Division of Housing, so that means HUD-VASH and 811 PRA, you need to meet the minimum accessibility standards that Division of Housing has identified through our voluntary compliance agreement with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. So that is defined on those accessibility standards for persons with mobility, who need mobility accommodations, as well as I believe it's visual and audio accommodations. So there are, and that's listed in the RFA. One also thing we're doing to hopefully, again, process improve the RFA is we are now requiring a letter of application. We have letters of intent. One challenge we have is your letter of intent and your application may change, right? We understand that may happen. So that letter of application is basically just, if you fine tune anything, right? If you've had conversations with host about how, or Division of Housing about which vouchers you're applying for, that will be noted in your letter of application. It's just really saying, okay, this is what we were planning for. This is what we're actually planning for. This is now, right? We've got a better sense of our financing. We are now applying for exactly this much grants and loans funding, for example. Okay, and then the other change is we have new contacts for the 811 program, and then we have Teresa. So Courtney Thompson, the Community Access Team voucher, is going to be your lead if you have questions on the 811 program. Definitely recommend reaching out to Courtney if you're planning to apply for 811 resources, so you understand, right, the connection, the referral process for those 811 resources is specific to the Community Access Team in their prioritization for folks coming out of assisted living, skilled nursing, folks coming through coordinated entry. So talk to Courtney before you submit an 811 project, even an LOI, and then Teresa will be your contact for the 9% pilot. And then questions for the Office of Housing, Finance, and Sustainability. Okay, those are the major updates. I want to turn it over for questions. I will have some time for recorded questions, and then if we don't have any recorded questions, I will stop the recording and we could have some unrecorded questions if folks want to do that. So any questions that folks have up front?
Zach, this is Kuhl again. Sorry, I keep asking questions.
No worries. No, makes it more exciting.
Right. So this is me just kind of being more, I guess, wondering kind of if there's a way or if there's thought behind having transparency for stakeholders like developers applying for these, as 2025 progresses. Is there a way for us to track where those 300 have been either allotted already or are slated to be allotted, and or can you give any color to what are, if any, reservations of the 300 are kind of slotted for the competitive rounds? For us, I think we would maybe be interested in a foreign state round, but it'd be good for us to know, well, in the 9% round, what got awarded out of those 300, and kind of, is there even a scoring matrix to say this score got awarded, this score didn't, so we can kind of judge how we respond to that second round?
Great question. And yes, so we have, I'll just drop in the chat here. This is the voucher availability tracker, which shows how many tenant-based vouchers, how many project-based vouchers are currently available. We will update that as we go through the application rounds. The challenge is, right, we will likely, because this is a partnership with Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, we will not know for sure if the 9% projects are moving forward until CHFA makes determinations. And then that will impact whether or not we have enough funding to potentially expand the pilot to make gap funding available for subsequent rounds. But we only have $10 million That is a fixed, to Teresa's again, and I don't want to step on toes, right? That is a fixed amount. And so we will not know if we will be able to extend that pilot for the 4% round until after CHFA makes its determination. So I fully understand that is not ideal for developers, but that is sort of where we're at right now.
Yeah, and then same, Zach, for the vouchers. I'm sorry, did that link have?
Yes, it has
Okay.
tenant-based and project-based vouchers. So we will, and the other benefit is that we will have that application tracker. So you can see who we will track. You can see everyone who has applied and submitted letters of intent. You can see everyone who followed up on their letter of intent with a letter of application. And that is linked right at the top of the 2025 PSH RFA under the public application tracker. And I'll drop a link to that as well as the chat. And so you'll see the 4 rounds are available in this document. We'll fill them in as we get applications. But that does mean, right? Everyone will know that you've put your hat in the ring for a resource. So our hope is that helps folks sort of gauge, okay, we've seen there were 15 applications for that 9% round for supportive housing projects. Oh man, if they're all applying for 60,000 per unit, the Division of Housing may very well not have funding to make that pilot for the 4% round. So that's just something I want to. Teresa, anything you want to add on that?
No, the only thing I would say is Zach's right. Like, we're not going to know until CHFA makes its determinations, but we're always happy to sort of talk with you about what we're seeing and what we understand. So if you're making those decisions and trying to vet, should I apply or not apply, feel free to pick up the phone and call us too, so we can talk through it with you.
Great, thanks, that's helpful.
Okay, any other questions? And then otherwise I'll stop the recording and we can I'll hang on for just another minute there.
Yeah, so if you apply for a competitive round and you receive funding from DOH for the vouchers and the supportive service dollars, but you don't get the CHFA award, do you just reapply then the next year for DOH? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So that if it's a competitive round, it would not scale. And if you are, and I appreciate you asking this question because this has come up in the past, letters of intent for competitive tax credit rounds do not transfer to subsequent rounds. We would need a new letter of intent. So if you have a 9% project, you're unsuccessful, and you want to reconfigure as a 4%, we would need a new letter of intent.
Okay.
Really.
And that applies for the gap funding as well. Obviously, it does not translate if you are unsuccessful in the CHFA round.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, I will go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, so much for watching. I know the hundreds of those who've tuned in over the next 12 months.